everybody. Welcome, welcome. I am so glad you guys are coming on in. That's wonderful. I'm so glad you're spending this next hour with us as you are arriving. Thank you so much for joining us. I know these days are very busy, especially if you have college applications going out the door. So I really appreciate your time. As you're filing in, if you want to take the opportunity in the chat button to say where you are in the world, what city you are in, what state you are joining us from. It's always such a pleasure to know where everyone is. Oh, there's Betsy Cadel. Hey, that's wonderful. Michigan, Seattle, wonderful. I love it. It's going so fast. Queens, New York, that's so great. Florida, wow, we are all over. New Jersey, thank you guys so much. If you're just still joining, you are not late. You are completely on time. Welcome to this wonderful conversation that we are going to be having tonight regarding the intersection between grief and college admissions. We are so, so lucky that you've chosen to be here with us this evening. Please use the chat function. Tell us where you are joining us from, what city you're in, what state you're joining us from. I would love to learn where everyone is. It's just always such a pleasure to know. I'm joining you from New York, and so that's where I am. And so it's always fun. San Diego, California. Welcome, California. So great to see you. A little bit more light than it is here in New York. It's so dark right now. So thank you so much for coming. We're going to let a couple more minutes go by so everyone can sign in and log on and get comfortable. We're so happy that you're here. Again, if you're just joining us, we're about 24 participants right now. Well over 60 signed up to register for tonight's event or this afternoon's event if you're joining us from California. So while everyone is coming in, please, if you're so inclined, tell us where you're joining us from, what city. Redwood City, California. Welcome, California. It's so great to have you here. Thank you so much again for coming. I'll start in about, a minute or so. So you still have time. Go get a drink of water if you want to. I'm more than happy to hang out for maybe about 45 more seconds before we get started. Oh, New York, New York. Hey, Molly. So glad to see you. I see you here, New York City, Manhattan. That's awesome. Anyone else want to share where they're chiming in from this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you're coming in from? I saw Queens and I saw California and Florida. Welcome, one and all. You are all so welcome to be here this evening. All right, I see some more people chiming in. That's great. I'm going to get started because if you are on time, you are in luck. We're not going to keep you waiting any longer. I am thrilled to have the opportunity to speak with you this evening and to hear your questions about grief and the college admissions process. This is a really hard time for the country. COVID-19 has really unnerved everything about who we are and how we approach our everyday. Now, pile on top of that something as just eye-dropping, eye-opening, jaw-dropping as college admissions, and that could really be stressful for any teen and their parents and their caregivers. So we get it, and we're here to answer your questions. I want you to have a little piece of paper if you want to write them down as we're talking, because something may just come to you and you might forget it when we talk and welcome you to ask questions. So please feel free to either take notes on your phone or maybe you have a piece of paper, write down your questions. It's really important. If you are a student, I especially want to hear from you. I know a lot of parents are going to be on this call tonight. I know guidance counselors are going to be on this call tonight. And I know grief specialists who work in hospitals and hospices, who work in support centers across the country are also on this call because they want to help those teenagers who are in their support group. So we want to hear from all of you when it's time for the Q&A section, which leads me to the start, which is the introductions. So if you don't know who I am, I'm just going to remind you where you are. My name is Allison Gilbert. I'm an author. I write a lot about grief and loss and resilience and being stronger in the face of adversity. This Zoom tonight is about the intersection between grief and college admissions. And I am floored, I am stunned, I am in awe of my two guests who are joining me tonight. Eric Furda he's the guy. He is the Dean of Undergraduate Admissions at the University of Pennsylvania. Hey, Eric, so happy to have you here. His co-author of The College Conversation is Jacques Steinberg. Hey, Jacques, so good to see you too. And Jacques and I have known each other for a long time. I am proud to consider him a friend. He is a former long-standing reporter for none other than the New York Times, and he's written many books. This is definitely not his first rodeo. So we are here with a seasoned nonfiction writer, a seasoned journalist who really also knows how to get to the bottom of this very pressing topic. Let me go over a couple of format issues for the way I envision the next hour evolving. So for the first 25 minutes, half an hour, I've prepared some questions that I'll be asking Jacques and Eric. Hopefully you will hear some of the questions that you've come to this discussion with. If I don't get to what you most want to hear, that's okay, because then I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to then let Christina, who's the other aspect I wanted to introduce. Christina Cerio is here. Christina is my right hand on all the Zooms that I always conduct. She will go through the chat. She will see where your questions are, where are the themes, what do you really want to explore. I am not going to call on folks to then come to the microphone, as you were, to kind of talk and ask their questions. There'll be one exception you'll soon see, but I'm going to use the chat function. The reason why I'm going to use the chat function for you to ask your questions of Eric and Jacques is because I think we'll get to more questions that way. My goal is quantity and quality. And I have felt that in the past, when I've had people ask their own questions on camera, we go on too long. We all like to have our own conversation. So let's use that chat button. If you don't want to be identified and you don't want Christina to say who you are when she kind of repeats the question to our guests, Jacques and Eric, what she can do is also do it without naming who you are. You can also private message her in the chat too, so your question is not shared with the group. So that's the format. I also wanted to acknowledge, before we really kind of dig in, that many of you have joined this discussion because you wanted that coupon code to my e-courses, my new e-courses. I promise you, I will give you that coupon code just for coming tonight. I'm so grateful to my e-courses. There's one course about planning and organizing virtual memorials. Right now, during COVID-19, we know that funerals are not the way they were, right? We need resources to make them as memorable and as meaningful as possible for our families and for our loved ones. So that is one of the courses. Another one of the courses that may be of real importance and of interest to this group is about grief and anxiety. So if any of these courses are what you've come here for and you want that coupon code, I understand. I will give it to you in the email when I say my thank you email when I send it out after this Zoom. So thank you again for joining us. So Eric Furda, I'm going to start with you because I feel like in many ways, you're like the main event. How rare is it to talk to the Dean of Undergraduate Admissions for UPenn? It is just kind of exciting to be able to ask you some kind of behind the curtain questions about what it's like to be the reviewer of these applications. And first, before we go any further, what is it like behind the curtain at Penn right now during COVID-19? You're about to get flooded and already are with applications. What is going on? Where are you right now?
Well, Allison and Christina, thank you for having both Jacques and me here this evening. We're so thrilled. Well, I'm in my kitchen right now, so here we go. Just as we all did some work, and just having our worlds just all come together. So and thank you for that introduction. Being a co-author with Jacques was a real honor, for me, and we're glad to share all of our knowledge with you this evening. So it's interesting with the question about where we are right now. If any of you have a child or you are a current senior and you're thinking about any type of early plan, early decision, or early action, and actually we have a pre-flight checklist in the book about this, right, Jacques? That deadline is this weekend. And so maybe an excerpt from the book is, really thinking about a deadline being on a Sunday. Don't wait till Sunday. Okay, there you go, Allison, right at the top of the show.
Yeah.
Maybe on Friday. I mean, that's a piece of advice that we give. Obviously, people at the Common Application and others that are responsible for these platforms will be there 24/7. But it is interesting when a deadline falls over a weekend or maybe some other time that you may not be able to pick up the phone and get the type of answer that you like. But I will really, kind of put it succinctly right now. I think for all of us on this call, we've learned a great deal since the middle of March with our work. I had the Penn Admissions Office together on Friday the 13th of all days in our visitor center, and we literally had our last information session on tour that day. And none of us knew that we would be still sitting here at the end of October, but we've learned a lot since then, right? And so we are prepared to evaluate and select the class virtually. And we finished the class of 2024 virtually, a lot of waitlist activity over the summer virtually, as well as our transfer pool. So we're ready to go for these deadlines that are right in front of us.
In what way, before I get to the grief specific questions, in what way is this harder and easier for how it works internally? Is there a difference between how you come together, how you talk about candidates, how you evaluate candidates in light of COVID-19? I'm interested in what's similar and what is completely dissimilar.
Well, I think that as an example, even before evaluation, we've been able to reach families without some of the friction and barriers that you would have in kind of our normal circumstances, right? Families didn't have to travel. Of course, you want to go to and visit a college campus, but we've actually had, a broader reach, and families have been able to connect with us in many different ways. So I think there's been kind of an expansive opportunity here, while the emotional part's not there. You love walking through campus, to keep that school on your list or cross it off of your list. I think what we really miss, and everyone on this has experienced this to some degree, is we have the platforms in order to get our work accomplished, but we're missing some of that hallway chat or those opportunities just to interact with each other, to talk about an applicant, maybe more casually, certainly in a private space, but to discuss the work in ways that we can support one another. And we have to be much more intentional, particularly as managers of an office, of how we can make sure that we're supporting our staff as they go through this critically important work, and work that they care about so much, and making sure that we give that attention and care that our applicants deserve.
Thank you. It's so fascinating to me to kind of peek behind the window that I would normally not be anywhere near. So I appreciate that so much. And Jacques, I want to turn to you now. You are an exceptional writer. Your pedigree working for the New York Times makes you the perfect segue to talk about the college application essays, the Common App essays, this special COVID-19 prompt and essay, the supplements. And I'm curious about when we talk about grief or when students talk about grief, this is a tough time. And maybe more than any year, we'll soon see, Eric, if this is a theme that you see so much more of, right, in these essays. But there's always been this concern about giving some so you appear vulnerable and real, and that you can make a connection with the readers who are looking at your application, and then just turning someone off, right? Maybe it's too much. Jacques, what is the balance? I mean, you've now written 2 books about college admissions. You wrote The Gatekeepers, and now you've written, of course, this book with Eric, The College Conversation. So what is the special sauce? What is the recipe when it comes to divulging, but maybe not in a way that maybe is unintentionally too intimate?
Yeah, so I appreciate the question, and I'm grateful to be with all of you here tonight. And the good news is that there's really not a formula for this, and which means that I think that's something reassuring to all of us, that all of us on the call, if you're a parent, if you're a student, if you're going through this process this year, or perhaps next year, there's not a one size fits all to this. Your intuition, your gut as a parent and as a student are going to be really helpful in terms of knowing where those sort of guardrails are that Allison mentions. So I'll start at the 30,000 foot level to put the essay in perspective, and then I'll come down to the essay level, and then I'll give some perspective as a writer and also as your proxy, parents and students. I tried to bring to this process the questions I think we all sort of have, and then how fortunate that in Eric we have a reader. Somebody who's read tens of thousands of applications. So I think you'll get 2 different angles on this. So first of all, in The College Conversation, the new book that Eric and I wrote together, this is a parent's guide to this process. And we break the conversation into 5 pieces. The first is conversations about discovery, and that's really your child's sense of self-discovery as supported by you parents if your child will have you in that conversation, and we certainly hope they will. The next piece is the search, really the looking at colleges that may or may not be a fit. And one of the ways that they may be a fit is in terms of support services, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. Then there's the application where Allison's question rests. Then the decision conversation, which is really decisions by the colleges, people like Eric and the admissions offices, and then you as a family. And then finally, the 5th conversation, the transition to college through the end of the first year. And I think all 5 of these conversations will come into play tonight. So the essay. What is the essay? There are so many parts of this, of a child's application where that student really doesn't quite come alive as a person, although there's important data points, grades when we have them, test scores when we have them, extracurricular activities, teacher references, counselor references, community service, extracurricular activities. But that essay is that one opportunity to introduce yourself to someone who very likely has never met you before. Maybe that admissions officer visited your school and you met the regional rep, but maybe somebody like Eric, the dean, is going to read that essay and yet you haven't met them. So the common application prompts are broad enough that there are lots of places you can go in the essay in terms of what you choose to write about. And I'll talk in a moment about the specific COVID-related essay that Allison mentioned. But let's talk about those other questions that are more generally about what do you value as a student? What's important to you? What inspires you? What are those formative experiences that have shaped your life, and how have you grown as a result? So if those are ultimately the framing, if you're thinking of Eric almost as somebody sitting across from you having a virtual cup of coffee and wondering about who you are in these sort of broad categories that I've mentioned, how do you layer into that Allison's question of grief? And it's entirely possible that as you talk about what you value and how you've grown and what's shaped you and what's formed you, and that loss is a part of that story. And it may be a part of the story that you as an applicant don't want to tell, and that's fine. But it may be a part of the story that you do want to tell. I think that, again, very few rules here, but probably the one line you don't want to cross is that this terrible thing happened to me, and as a result, show mercy on me and admit me. And for my book, The Gatekeepers, I spent a year in the admissions office at Wesleyan University watching an entire class be admitted. And surprisingly to me, there were some essays with that tone, you know, full stop, woe is me, throw myself on the mercy of the court. There were few of them, but they did happen. But most students who talked about grief and loss, in my experience, did so in the context of how they overcame, of resilience, a word that Allison used earlier, how they were different, ways that perhaps their role in the family changed, ways that perhaps they lost ground at school because of time away. And you can only imagine this year how some of these conversations have been, these experiences have been magnified. So I would say if your child is inclined to go there in the essay and it sort of checks these boxes that I've talked about in terms of sort of who they are and why and how, I guess my advice would be to sort of follow their gut. I want to sort of pause, Allison, on that question about the specific COVID question, and let's hold that one. And I want to throw to Eric. In the book, we do it sort of just like this, my perspective as a writer on the essay, and then Eric's as a professional reader. So Eric, to sort of put to you Allison's question, when an essay like this lands on your desk, and there may be more than a few of them this year, how do you sort of process an essay like that?
Jacques and I use the kind of this concept of a mosaic with the application, Allison, and you know, all these different pieces are going to come together in some way. And it's more like an abstract painting in a way, right? Okay, it's not these nice, clean, neat lines. And so, you know, one piece I'd like to add to introduce this is, you know, there are questions on the application that a discerning admission officer, just when you ask about parent background, I mean, there are factual questions on the application where someone will see that my mother or father is deceased and the date. Okay, this is when you're just like filling out your address, right? You know, this seems like a very straightforward part of the application. Now, an admission officer is going to pick up on that, whether they make note of it or not, mental or otherwise, while it may resurface in the application at another time, a counselor letter, a teacher letter, certainly depending on the proximity of time to the student applying to college. So it's not like this information isn't there in some way. And then, you know, the question that you ask is a good one. How much do you want to kind of lift that up or maybe magnify it a little bit? And Jacques and I had a lot of fun talking about the essay portion because of the writer and the reader roles that we have. And we each give about a half dozen examples. I think, I'm not going to go through all of them, certainly, but I want to touch on a couple of them, just the headlines, so maybe you'll understand that if a student feels that they should go there, that they can go there. One is be willing to embrace complexity and nuance. Okay, is this straightforward, or is there something else that needs to be understood here? This isn't just a factual reporting. There's something else that we need to consider here. I think this is a great one. Take with a grain of salt those so-called hard and fast rules. When we talk about COVID, we actually wrote a piece that said you can go there. Some individuals may say, don't go there when you're talking about grief, the loss of a loved one, a parent, a sibling. So, you know, again, there's nuance to all of this. And, you know, here's another piece that I'll just add. Let us hear your voice. This is to the student. Let us hear your voice. This is from your perspective. And obviously, this is a heavy topic to write about while as a 17 or 18-year-old, thinking about maybe how I process this information, what I want to share, what I want to say, that's important to you. And I think that's worth sharing if you're comfortable, kind of going there again. And there aren't hard and fast rules about this, because I think sometimes people feel like, yes, you should write about something like this, or no, you should not.
So what I'm hearing and what I want to just make sure I'm digesting and then underscoring is that grief is not off limits. In fact, if you can then extract a lesson that you learned, a new role you had to play in your family, and you can maybe kind of add for yourself the lessons that have come from the experience, even if it's new, if there's a reason why it's important to you, that falls into the category of there are no rules, and you're actually representing who you are in this part of the application that really gives you that freedom. Sounds like that's right.
Yeah, I mean, and with the only caveat being you as a parent might want to encourage your child to go there, hearing this conversation, hearing Eric. Your child may have other ideas. For students who are on the call, you may not want to go there, and that's okay too. I think audience is really important. And Eric and I wrote this book together because when I was at the New York Times, he was a go-to gold-plated source. He was somebody I would go to who would help explain things to me and explain things to readers. And it began a more than a decade-long conversation between the two of us. But in the course of my work, I've interviewed hundreds of admissions officers, and the empathy that you sort of hear from Eric tonight, it's not necessarily unique. To the contrary, I think there's a certain kind of person who goes into a line of work like this. We may think that admissions officers get excited about saying no more than they can say yes. But I would argue that they want to say yes far more often than they can. And so if your child and students who are on the call, if you can imagine someone like Eric receiving that essay, a real live human being who's had all kinds of life experiences themselves, I think that it might put you a little more at ease about the question, Allison, that you're posing.
Jacques, while I still have you here on camera talking right now, I want to switch the topic from essays to finances. So COVID is evolving. Our ability to pay is changing. I say we as in parents to pay is changing. There could be job loss in the family. There, of course, are deaths in the family that change the financial circumstances. So I'm wondering what you can say about the evolving process of the money issues that may be specific to those families who are newly grieving, right? There's a new sense of financial concern. And then I'll flip it to Eric for some other financial questions. But Jacques, could I perhaps start with you about this is a real inflection point. Some families who may not have had financial concerns may now all of a sudden have issues because they've lost one of the breadwinners in their family.
Yeah, and it's an important question. And again, one of our goals in writing the college conversation and speaking with you here tonight is to put you all at ease, not to give you false hope, but to let you know that there are avenues and people to explore questions like Allison asks. So we talked about folks in the admissions office who may be a little more empathetic than you might have imagined. I would say that the same is true about the financial aid office. And when I was at the New York Times, I spent a day in the financial aid office at Providence College in Providence, Rhode Island, just sitting at the elbow of the director of financial aid as she fielded more than 100 requests, exactly like Allison said. Hey, when we, the financial aid information that's in the FAFSA, when we tabulated that information, when we filled out the FAFSA, our family's finances have changed dramatically in a negative direction since that was filled out. And there was a person in that office, as there are in every financial aid office, who's charged with listening to those appeals. And in the case of when I was there, it was for students who were already enrolled and who suddenly could not pay their tuition, even though their FAFSA suggested that they could. But for those on the call who are children applying or parents of children who are applying, I would encourage you to reach out to the financial aid offices at the schools to which your children are interested, and putting Allison's question. Look, we want to be really honest. This has happened. We know that you say perhaps that you will meet all demonstrated financial need, but what does that really mean? And what might that mean in our case? And what can we do? You can use these folks, I would suggest, as a resource to answer questions like this. And they can be generic questions. You can ask more general questions of these folks and then ask institution specific. But it's a really important avenue in addition to the college counselor at your high school. Eric, would you agree that the financial aid offices are a resource for questions like Allison is posing, even for someone who hasn't even applied to the school yet?
Well, the professionals within these offices, as you suggested, Jacques, they are there to support families. They want families and students to be successful. And there's certainly tools like the net price calculator that's on every college admission and financial aid website. And I'm sure the folks on this call are aware of that. While circumstances change, I mean, it's interesting that we're talking about, the free application for federal student aid. That's being the form that's being used, or the year that's being used for that, was actually your child's junior year. So if you submitted your taxes on time in your child's junior year last year, the circumstances probably had not adjusted yet because of COVID. So that's already an outdated document for many families. And it's a wonderful idea that, using that year as the baseline, there was good reasons for why that was changed a few years back. But in some ways, it makes that form that you filled out already obsolete. So you're already needing to explain yourself in different ways. Some of you may also already have children in college, and that financial aid offices, if you reached out to them, I mean, students, as an example, could not have a summer earnings expectation this past summer. Unemployment's high, unless there's certain work for an 18-year-old, that's the individual that would be hired. I mean, we waived the summer earnings expectations at Penn, and that became grant for students, money they didn't pay back. Now, I'm very fortunate to work at an institution that has the financial resources, Allison, that the University of Pennsylvania has. At many institutions, they may want to meet you where you are financially. That may be an additional loan. They may not have the resources as an institution to give institutional grant money. So that may become a parent loan, that may become another student loan. And so then that's where I think some of these conversations come in again. What does the debt level look like upon graduation as I'm making some of these adjustments? I think for those students and families that were close to graduation, it was, okay, this is going to get us to the finish line. I think that conversation could be very different if this is your first or second year of college and looking at those finances.
Before I ask my last question, before I open it up to everyone who is on this call for their own questions, I want to remind you that we're going to take your questions in the chat. Christina Cerio is on the call. She's going to look through the chat. She's going to see which questions might be the most broad. Don't ask Eric about your child's application to UPenn, please. We're not talking about a specific application here. We want to make this call as useful to the most people possible. So please think about your questions, write them into the chat, because after this next question that I'm going to ask, I am going to open the floor. So get those questions in so we can look at them in the meantime. The last question I really wanted to talk about is mental health services on campus. When we have traditionally, I say we in the broadest of sense, when we go look at schools, perhaps we look at how beautiful it is, or we look at the football stadium or the baseball fields or the black box theaters, and we kind of have big eyes for what's right in front of us. And I'm wondering, because of COVID-19 and the subject that we're talking about tonight, about the intersection with grief and loss, how can parents and students evaluate from the outside in what are those essential mental health services that will be available once they arrive on campus? Now, obviously, every school is going to be different, and that's the point, right? should that be a part of the decision-making at this point? And if it is a part of the decision-making, how do you evaluate which schools have robust offerings and which ones may have thinner and maybe not enough for where your student is at this moment? Eric, I'll start with you if that's okay.
Certainly. Thank you, Allison. So when I think about the last maybe 8 to 10 years, I've been back at Penn for 12 years now, the lifting of stigma around mental health and mental health support and well-being of students, the amount of work that has taken place to say it's okay to ask for help. Okay, that's like, you know, Jacques and I like index cards. We put our ideas down on index cards, and here's my index card for this evening. To let students know and families know that there are resources that you should ask for help, and those resources are there for a reason. And actually, Allison, we can see statistics on this that the support services at our institutions have seen a vast increase in students using those support resources. And part of that is because we've lifted the stigma of asking for help. You asked whether there is some way to assess kind of a college or university's resources. I think you could see as an example, and this was suggested to us as we were writing this book, at Penn, we have a chief wellness officer, Dr. Benoit Dubé, and he reports right into the top of the institution. So that may say something about reporting lines, may suggest something about the importance. I'm not saying if it's somewhere else, it's not important, but you should be able to find it on an org chart somewhere, okay? And where those sources are. An external source, and many of you may be aware of this foundation, is called the JED Foundation, J-E-D Foundation. And they come in as a third party to assess resources of support for students at an institution and make strategic recommendations about where they see maybe opportunities, shortcomings, etc. So there's a vast amount of literature. We, in the college conversation, also cited a book called The Stressed Years of Their Lives. And one of the co-authors for that book is a faculty member, Dr. Anthony Rothstein at the University of Pennsylvania. So there are resources there. And maybe just one other piece, I don't want to overstay my welcome on this question, is you could ask these questions, as we suggested earlier, independently of the admissions process. Find out what the support services are, reach out, have a discussion with some of these professionals, because you're trying to determine whether this is a good school for you and for your child, right? Or for your child and for you as a family. So this is a big part of your due diligence to make sure it's the right fit.
So Jacques, Jacques, I'm just going to ask you to put on your investigative reporter hat for a second. So, you have that kind of street cred, to your record. And I'm wondering, how would you go about evaluating the veracity of those programs and if they're going to really be of service to your child once that child lands on campus? I appreciate what Eric had to say about, the charts and, what programs are there. And I love the idea of really taking advantage of the JED Foundation. That is brilliant. But I'm wondering, if you're kind of Googling around, you're looking at a school, what questions would you ask yourself as the investigative reporter about how good these resources might be? Or is that just too hard and too much to ask?
No, I think it's absolutely appropriate. And I think that a lot of these schools on the surface look really similar. And yet when you drill down is where you get the differentiation. And one of those areas is investment in counseling and in support services as a whole. And I think you're seeing a theme here of, we're encouraging potentially parents, you or children, you reaching out to financial aid offices to do some due diligence. I think absolutely it's appropriate to work out, figure out where is the counseling seated on campus, and reaching out and asking those questions. Something as simple as, what is the ratio of counselors per student? What is the average wait time to get an appointment? How many appointments do you get? And then at a certain point, they say, you know what, you've exhausted the number that you're entitled to under the student health plan. We're now going to give you a list of professionals off campus who you can see from there. How many appointments does that take? how close by are those folks situated? And so I think if you come up with those questions, parents in partnership with your children, and then sort of figure out who's going to ask those questions. And as Allison says, put on your investigative reporter hat. Don't ask necessarily in an aggressive way, but certainly those are fair questions. And Eric, I can't imagine a college where you would call as a parent or student and ask those questions where you wouldn't get answers to those questions. It might take you a few phone calls, but I think there are people that are only too happy to answer. And I think you will see wide divergence, parents, in the responses to those questions based on the level of investment. But I think it's really important to know what your child is going to have as a safety net when they arrive.
And I would probably add, you might actually learn how you're spoken to when you do ask these questions. And that might be a very good tip off to you too about what kind of school that is that you're about to send your child to. So if you get a welcoming response on the phone, or you get someone who's kind of passing you off, it could be an indication, just one, of what kind of community feel your child might get once they're on campus. I'm not saying it's definitive, but it could be a clue potentially. I do want to I've enjoyed the conversation, but enough about me asking questions. I want to go to everyone who's joined us with their questions, but I do want to give a nod of my hat to the only person who emailed me a question prior to this event even starting, which is just, kudos. So Betsy Cadel, you are the founder of College Essay Helpers. You help students craft their essays. You don't write them for them. I know you don't, but you help them get their voice. And I know you had a really interesting question to ask Eric and Jacques, and I'm so glad to pass the mic on to you, Betsy. What is your question for them?
Well, Allison, thank you so much. And Eric and Jacques, this has been amazing. I've really enjoyed it. This really dovetails beautifully, my question, to what you were just talking about mental health and the support. Conversations that I have frequently with my colleagues and the students are the red flag question. What might raise a red flag? Concerns over divulging mental illness, depression, anxiety, ADHD, learning disabilities, dealing with, abuse or suicide. What is your feeling when you're reading these essays of, I don't know if this person, even if their essay is about overcoming an obstacle, is there a red flag to you when someone talks about their mental illness or other issues like that? Would you advise not to do that?
Betsy, do you mean a red flag like the admissions office would say, we don't want that problem on our campus?
Would that be concerning to you in any way if a student were talking about, being debilitated, needing to go to a facility?
Interesting.
If they're
Eric, I guess that's for you.
Yeah, it's such a great question, and I'm going to try to unpack it a little bit. And Betsy, thank you for emailing and then also asking the question. There is that first sense of individuals that share information with us. It's kind of going back to the stigma before. They have already kind of navigated some of this already, and they're speaking to us about it. And in some ways, that could give us some assurance. Okay. And again, there's no hard and fast rules to this. There's nuance here. A young person who talks about, cutting themselves. And that's something that they wanted to share. It's, of course, we discuss this seriously. And, it's the individual who's sharing something with us so that we know that they have already learned perhaps how to work through different pieces, cope, know when red flags go up for them, stress during finals or midterms. It's the students, whenever something happens on campus, most of the time, you'll go back to the file and say, gee, there's nothing here. So it's usually the students that you're not aware of anything about. And that's not because we denied everybody else, so none of the other ones are there, right? And so, I think that's a big part of it. It's, okay, this is a young person who's already talking about an eating disorder or some other experience that they had. And maybe it'll come up in other parts of the application, but quite often not. Many times other teachers or counselors may not know about this. And it's the student sharing that information with us. Now, you might have expected me to say something like that, and it's true. On the other side, a real question that we'll ask ourselves at any institution is this the best environment for this young person? Penn can be seen as, well, we're an urban institution. It's fast paced, it's highly competitive. There's, you could go to any institution and say, well, is this the place are we the right place for this student? Not is this student the right one for us, but are we the right place for this student? And of course, when you have a single digit admit rate, you're making difficult decisions anyway. Now, here's a recommendation that I would make. When a student shares information like that within an application, and if they're admitted, they should then reach out to those other offices that we've already discussed, because any number of privacy laws and rules, it's not like we're calling, our health center and saying, oh, by the way, look out for Eric. Okay, we're not, we can't share that in that manner. And so, there's some real, walls there. So, we want to make sure that if it's something that a student has shared with us, we may encourage them to say, gee, make sure that you speak to your academic advisor. That could be the first line. We talked about financial aid advisors. Sometimes they'll pick up the phone and say, the student's coming in and asking that they need more resources to attend, but there may be something else underneath here, and that could be anything.
Right.
So we always try to connect the dots, even at larger places like the University of Penn. I think at the end of this, and I think this is along the lines for Jacques, it's what you said before, Jacques. You'll be your own gut check, I think, is important.
Yeah, and I want to just piggyback on one part of your question, Betsy, regarding learning challenges, which was part of your question. And Eric and I talk a lot about fit, but we try to give sort of a little more nuanced definition than just that word fit. And we talk, Allison mentioned the 4 C's when you're evaluating a college: the community, the culture, the curriculum, and the conclusions. How do things wind up for students once they've been at an institution? And the 5th C is cost, which we've already talked about. But those things, aspects of community, really speak to those notion of supports. We talked about mental health supports. What about tutoring? What about the writing center? What's the ratio of writing advisors to students? And it may well be, regardless of whether you choose to go there in your essay or not, as Eric said, your child may need an environment that is more supportive, not just in terms of its mental health, but also in terms of its academic supports. And there's a book I want to recommend called The K&W Guide to Students with Learning Challenges. I'll get the exact title, but if you type in K&W Guide, this is a book that sort of looks a little bit like the FISC Guide or the Princeton Review Guide, but it looks at hundreds of colleges based on their support services. And that can be an interesting way to differentiate among institutions as your child works with you and a counselor to come up with a college list. And for students who are admitted to institutions and then choose to enroll, a lot of the supports that they had in high school, a lot of the accommodations can be ported over to their new learning environment in their college environment. The summer can be a critical time to reach out and find out what are the forms that need to be filled out, what are the evaluations that are needed. But this can be a really rich and important way to evaluate an institution and also provide conditions for success.
Christina, before I hand it off to you to kind of tell us what the questions have come in, I wanted just to take the opportunity as a board member of the National Alliance for Grieving Children. There's also plenty of resources on that website for support centers across the country that do also serve college students. And so once you go to a university and you're seeking grief support, the National Alliance for Grieving Children has resources on its website that go state by state. You can perhaps find a center near the planned university that you want to attend, and they do have specific, many of them, support groups for college students. And I would also recommend one more resource, which is Heal Grief. The students AMF, the AMF community has chapters across many college campuses, and that is also for students on college campuses who are grieving. And so there are very specific resources that if the university itself doesn't offer, they're definitely there and accessible logistically and within a geographic range that you can access. So Heal Grief is one. And of course, NAGC, the National Alliance for Grieving Children, has resources for college students and young adults as well. Christina, what do you got for us?
Okay, the first question I have is maybe for Eric. It says, how do you think COVID will change admissions? Do you think many schools will be accepting more students due to the potential amount of deferrals for next year?
I think, well, Christina, thank you for reading that, and thank you for contributing the question to the individual who asked it. Is, we're still in this right now, right? Even though the early decision deadline is this weekend. And I think when we kind of step back from this a little bit, is what is college enrollment going to look like over the next 4 years, 8 years, maybe even longer? And I think for the students who are juniors and seniors right now, or let's put this right in the lane of seniors, that there are any number of factors that are still unknown that could influence what the enrollment on a college campus looks like even next semester. The announcement of what learning looks like on any college campus next semester, how those plans need to get adjusted based on health conditions, how many students who are current students take a leave of absence. Then you also just have the students who will take a gap year, who took a gap year from last year into this year. And as with last year, at least at Penn, and I know other institutions, but I'll speak for Penn, we went into our wait list for close to 400 students. And in a typical year, that could be 40, 50, range 0 to 120.
Wow,
So
wow.
They're going to have to, continue to monitor and see what their comfort level is and what their enrollment needs are, and balance that then also with the expenses that have been, really underwritten by many institutions, as I've already mentioned. So I think for families, control what you can control. There's going to be these other questions, while also I think, with the type of advice that we try to give is, don't try to solve for things that you can't solve for. Try to keep this within your own lane.
That sounds like an algebra question, but very good. All right, Christina, what else do you have?
Okay, next question is also COVID related. There seem to be a lot less opportunities for extracurricular activities, summer jobs, etc. because of COVID. How does a student make up for this lacking part of the normal application?
So I would say, I'm going to throw to Eric very quickly in response to this question, but one thing I suspect he will say is for students, if you're on the call, and parents, an admissions officer is looking at 4 years of your experience in high school and outside of high school. And so all those things that happened prior to the spring of this year, they're still part of your story and who they are. And an admissions officer is going to understand that there have been some disruptions. But then, of course, there is that period between March and now, Eric, where an athlete may not have been able to play the sport that they love, or all kinds of other clubs haven't been possible, or community service in person or otherwise. Eric, in the spirit of the question, what would you say to that student or parent?
Well, for the juniors in March, current seniors, you already have a record. And Jacques was really saying that there's already a record there. And so maybe you weren't able to realize that captainship or the musical production was not, played at the level that it was. Maybe it went virtual, but there's kind of that growth chart. I've used this analogy and Jacques hasn't told me to not use this anymore. So maybe I'll think about it. It's like you have the growth chart, but now from last March, there's just kind of the dotted line. We think it may still progress this way, but maybe it doesn't. Here's for the listeners right now and viewers right now, the group that I'm really thinking about, because again, I think for the seniors, there's already a record. The freshmen in high school, we're not finished with this. Freshman in high school, sophomore in high school, we're not going to lean on, gee, in 7th grade, this is what they did, although it's wonderful. A lot of us peaked in 7th grade, by the way. Right? And so, I'm really mindful of what this looks like 4 years from now, 6, 8, as I've already said, because I think we need to give special attention to the young people who are just entering secondary school in these conditions.
Christina, let's do some lightning round questions. Like give us some 2 or 3 quick questions.
Okay. Is there a section on the Common App to share death of a sibling?
That's interesting.
There, within the family section, I should say, there would be an opportunity there to put that information down, basically. And it's not like the same way for the parents, where it's highlighted in that section, but there's enough free form section there that you could put that down.
Great question. Thank you. All right. 2 more maybe.
Is the date of death taken into consideration when looking at grades in a certain semester?
Yeah, no, it's like since you're the one doing the looking.
You got it. So, I'll broaden this in a very succinct way in lightning round. Is there's usually something underneath, something like a grade that doesn't fit the pattern of what you've already seen. And don't be afraid to address that, even if it's in the additional information section. It doesn't have to be an essay. There's a section on the Common App called additional information. There's maybe some other context there. Certainly, if it's very clear and we have these discussions, look at the spring of sophomore year and we see on the Common App, listed for the parent and or referenced by a counselor or somebody else that, of course, this is what took place. And here are some of the some of the impact that this has had on this young person. So absolutely, you can see that.
And Eric, you said it quickly, but I just want to reinforce the role of the college counselor in your child's high school. That can be a place where this is either described more fully by a third party who can say, you will notice that so-and-so's grades dropped in the spring of sophomore year. I want to tell you why. And so the counselor can be really, really helpful in either amplifying or being perhaps the only place where that information is disclosed, if that's what your child prefers.
That's great. All right, Christina, one more
question. We got this one twice. Do you have resources for scholarships for grieving students?
That's interesting. We give scholarship information in the book, and I'll actually turn it to the experts. Allison, I'm not aware.
That is a great question. I'm going to completely say I have no idea, but I will find out. So that is my homework from this call. It is such a great question. I'm stumped and I shouldn't be stumped. So I'm going to get the information. And if you want to, if whomever Christina emailed or texted that question, I can get their email address. I will personally make sure that that information gets to your inbox as soon as I have it, for sure. Let me just end, because I really want to respect everyone's time, by saying if you joined tonight, I am so grateful. If you only joined, I should say, for the code to get the $30 off my new e-courses, I have your back. I will send you that exclusive $30 off code for the 3 courses. One is on how to plan and organize the most meaningful virtual memorial. There's another one about grief and anxiety, and there's 2 more about objects and heirlooms and photographs and home movies, and how we can all get more joy out of those items and heirlooms that our loved ones left behind. So I have your back. I have not forgotten to give you your code. Jacques Steinberg, Eric Furda, you guys are awesome. Your book is called The College Conversation. I love the book. I love the approach of the book. I love the tone of the book. And I love the fact, Jacques, I never really spoke about this when you said it, but you really touched on that these are conversations to be had between parent and child, or child and caregiver, when it comes to making these monumental decisions. And I love the fact that these can be springboards to just new dialogue that perhaps you wouldn't normally have about what you value, what's most important to you, Jacques, right? I mean, this is what you really talk about in the book. And I love that, Jacques and Eric, so much. So I just want to say that The College Conversation is the book. Please go get your copy. It's fantastic. And Christina, thank you for going through all the questions tonight in the chat. I'm so grateful for your time. I will send an email tomorrow with the link to Jacques and Eric's book for sure. I will send you a link with that coupon code. It is 8 o'clock on the nose, so I'm going to respect everyone's time. I want to say thank you so much for giving us part of you tonight and making time for us. I know Jacques and Eric are just saying thank you with me, and I hope that we answered at least some of your questions about the intersection of grief and college admissions. So thank you guys so much for being here. I really appreciate it, and we'll see you soon. Good night, everybody.